Hello, and welcome to this fourth presentation in the workshop Bullets and Banknotes, War Financing Through the 20th Century. Today, it is my immense pleasure to welcome Dr. Mathieu Bidaux. Dr. Bidaux was recently awarded his doctorate from Université de Rouen in Normandy, France, with whom he is still associated as a researcher working on the banknote industry. Moreover, Dr. Bidaux works for Worms, a company, as their resident historian. Created 172 years ago, the bank has been an actor in financing large enterprises, specifically in the energy sector. Dr. Bidaux has recently completed a book in collaboration with Christian Labaille on the naval construction that took place on the banks of the Seine from 1917 to 1966. It is yet to be available in English, but I am assured that this version will soon be available. A link to the French book will be attached below. Today, Mathieu will be presenting the provision of banknotes in a time of war. The talk will cover monetary production of both the Vichy regime and the Free French movement during the Second World War, and the issues that both faced with accessing money. So, over to you, Dr. Bidaux.
Thank you, David. So, I would like to divide my speech into two parts. Firstly, I will start with the case of banknotes in Vichy France and problems relating to their supply. I will then elaborate on the case of the Free French, which is of particular interest today within this workshop, about the economic dimension of resistance, or rather, one of the forms of resistance. A society at war needs money, of course, and both Vichy France, like Free France, needed to print banknotes to carry out their policies during World War II. On both sides, it was necessary to build and maintain trust in the currency. This allowed both governments to hold onto their respective territories and to keep power. Equally, it allowed them to conquer, to rely, and to hold onto the colonies, bringing them into the campaign to liberate France. To better understand this topic, we must acknowledge an important fact. Banknotes have been the main method of payment since the First World War. In France, everything was paid thanks to banknotes: salaries, purchases, stocks. This was the golden age of banknotes. They represented 50 to 60% of the money supply in France. Because of the war, currency circulation greatly developed. In the short term, inflation grew, and with the rising prices, the shortages caused by the World War engendered a growing need for banknotes that became ever more urgent. There was a never-present threat caused by a lack of money. Manufacturing needed to keep pace with the Bank of France, and consequently for Vichy France, which controlled the money supply in metropolitan France and within the colonies at the very start of the conflict. To maintain power and sovereignty over the territories, it was felt that needs were required to be met by French means. Money had to be manufactured by the French banknote industry, so as not to depend on another currency, in particular, that of the Reichsmark. So you can see the issues of this situation. Since the French defeat, Vichy France succeeded in excluding the Reichsmark from domestic trade, so trade with the occupation army was conducted in France. We must recall this achievement, however limited it may appear. Also, Vichy retained monetary authority over the colonial empire, which constantly remained under threat of conquest by the Allies. A graph will far more eloquently explain this situation in France. I'm going to share my PowerPoint. Okay. Here is my speech divided in 2 points. And here is my graph. As you can see, there is an exponential curve that shows the growing needs. So, how do you stock up on banknotes in a world at war? My first point is the Bank of France strategy is to supply France and the colonies to maintain its monetary sovereignty. First, they lowered the quality requirements for banknotes. In a context of peace, to maintain trust in the French currency, the Bank of France must combine technical requirements and produce sufficient quantities of banknotes. But in a context of increasingly heavy constraints being placed on the banknote industry as the conflict continued, shortages of paper occurred. There were difficulties in ensuring the supply of raw materials such as rami, cotton, and there were constant threats of bombing on factories. I speak of factories, several factories in the plural, because there is a Bank of France paper mill in Vic-le-Comte and a fiduciary printing factory in Chamalières. These two factories near Clermont-Ferrand were well located and not very far from Vichy. I also speak of factories plurally because we must mention the private industries that were called on for help by the Bank of France to meet their growing needs. Ouverture printing, Drager printing, Crèvecoeur paper mills, and Rive paper mills were very important auxiliaries. The paper quality, the inks, and the wearing of the printing plates all posed a threat to the appearance of the banknotes. The industrial equipment was subjected to significant usage, and it suffered because of this. It should be understood that if the banknotes are not standardized, if their manufacture is not homogeneous, minimal differences can occur from one banknote to another. This can instill doubt in the minds of the bearers of banknotes, and thus counterfeits can slip into circulation and weaken confidence in the currency. If there is no more trust, exchanges can be disrupted. So the Bank of France relaxed the manufacturing rules. Various amalgamations of paper pulp were made, whereas before, the composition of the pulp was strictly regulated. The same face value can be made with two different raw materials. To the touch, a difference could be noted, but in this context, there was no choice. To ensure the quantities of currency in circulation, the banknote manufacturing department also reduced the size of the banknotes. One can print more on a single sheet. Another way to save time was the elimination of cross-checking in the quality of banknotes. This was an operation that caused delays in deliveries and the speed at which they occurred are key. Why were there delays? This was due to the lack of staff for several reasons. Some workers were sent to the STO or obligatory work service, others to the youth camps. A number were declared sick and no longer came to the factory. Moreover, a number of workers left the factory to join the resistance, although quite how many is difficult to say. On June 9, 1944, a head count revealed that 90 people were declared sick and 52 gave no reason for their absence. Some went into the forest to join the Maquis. Others joined the French army. After the conflict, they returned to their jobs at the factory. And the Chamalia printing press continued to live under the threat of Allied bombardments until the end of the war. Also, the Bank of France printers were replaced by women in the manufacturing workshops and by young apprentices who were sometimes as young as 14 years old. There was immense pressure on them, and for good reason. They needed to continue delivering banknotes around France and to its empire. Since it was the Bank of France that produced the colonial banknotes, you can clearly imagine the difficulties encountered during wartime. However, the deliveries decreased and the bank only concentrated on France. Meanwhile, for Free France, the movement's clear progression continued as they were helped to grow by increasing numbers of rallying troops and territories. Here is the chronology of those who rallied to the Free French. And to make this possible, Free France had to supply these territories with banknotes. And that leads us to my second point. The policy of the Caisse Centrale de la France Libre was to supplying banknotes to the territories joining Free France. In his memoir, General de Gaulle wrote, "In the vast expanses of Africa, France could rebuild an army and a sovereignty. It was therefore absolutely necessary to gain the trust of these liberated populations so that economic exchanges could continue within the empire, but also between Free France and the Allies. The French National Committee, the governing body of Free France, was a sort of government in exile in England. It was established by ordinance as the Caisse Centrale de la France Libre on December the 2nd of 1941. However, for what purpose? De Gaulle asked these questions. How to bring to life as a whole the territories rallied in Africa and Oceania? We who still had neither bank, nor currency, nor transport, nor transmissions, nor recognized commercial representation abroad. How to maintain the forces of Free France distributed in all parts of the world? How do we count the value of the materials and services provided to us by our allies and those we provided to them? In fact, the Caisse Centrale replaced the currencies issued by Vichy France in the rallied territories of the colonial empire. Once they had joined Free France, a territory could no longer continue relying on mainland France for the supply of their banknotes. Currency shortages were to be avoided at all cost. The liberation of territories was an action based in practicality, largely to help finance the ongoing battle to free the colonial empire. So how was this done? To finance a war, help can always be sought from a bank of issue. This bank of issue can obtain advances or issue treasury bills which are shown on the bank of issue's assets. The sum of advances or treasury bills makes it possible on the liabilities side of the balance sheet to issue banknotes. A bank of issue can issue banknotes of much higher amounts than the initial starting capital or advance. This is what the Caisse Centrale were going to do by getting an advance from the British government. We have a letter from Cassin, the Free French legal expert, dated November 28th of 1941, thanking the Chancellor of Exchequer for the advance of the equivalent of 100 million francs in pounds sterling. The financial, monetary, and economic agreements of March 19, 1941, between Free France and the British Treasury, fixed the exchange rate between the pound sterling and the franc. This was the pre-war rate, meaning £1 for 176 francs. The territories who relied prior to the creation of the Caisse Centrale gave credibility and real utility to this bank of issue. From this point onwards, Free France existed, monetarily speaking. An advance in pound sterling, the international currency, also appears to have offered an important guarantee of credibility. The Caisse Centrale was empowered to receive all payments and contributions from the liberated territories, advances from the British Treasury, and donations from the French abroad. In other words, it held and protected the gold and resources of all the free French territories and their banks of issue. Cassin took stock of it every year from November 30th, 1941. Free France obtained the privilege of issuing banknotes to whichever territories were won and relied to the movement. This step was essential, but it did not suffice to supply the colonies monetarily. It was therefore necessary to print these banknotes. And for this, you can see some examples here. The Caisse Centrale called upon British factories in the banknote sector, notably St. Luke's Printing Works, the printing house of the Bank of England, and Bradbury, Wilkinson and Company. The Caisse Centrale's orders show that 5, 25, 100 and 1,000 banknotes were made for Free French Africa from as early as the beginning of 1941 by St. Luke's Printing Works. According to a telegram dated March 18, 1941, it was Free France in London that actually paid for the African banknotes. There are examples of orders from £25,000 to £46,000. The banknotes were designed by Dulac, a British artist of French origin. They show a Marianne in the center of the banknote to clearly demonstrate that the Republic is in London. Each side of Marianne's face is shown and crosses of Lorraine finished with encores. All were symbols of the Free French. For high denomination banknotes, the choice was made to portray a phoenix, which emerges from a flame and rises from the ashes. The meaning of these symbols was without any ambiguity. The British manufacturers were engaged in an industrial race. One has to produce and do so quickly. At Bradbury, they considered setting up a faster paper machine. This was due to the risk of social crisis that threatened to engulf the Free French territory. The Free French territories should currency be lacking. The ability of the Caisse Centrale to provide a means of payment must have influenced the rallying of parts of the empire to the Free French movement. They had urgent need of banknotes, in particular to pay the workers of the Free French Equatorial Africa. Had they not done so, the workers would have been dismissed. The governor of Cameroon sent a telegraph stating that 3 regions of the territory, and I quote, threatened to dismiss workers from the construction sites and the administration of gold mining. Cameroon received only 103 million in small denominations, a number clearly insufficient. The Treasury is absolutely unable to satisfy the demands for supplies, having no more reserves. The shortage of small notes has been pointed out on several occasions, and we are in August 1943. Nazi Germany was well aware of this weakness in the parts of the empire which had relied to the Free French. It bombed the factories of the British banknote sector and sunk maritime convoys, some of which were carrying banknotes. In April 1943, a ship was sunk while on its way to help resolve the currency crisis in French Somalia by carrying notes to the country. A second ship, therefore, had to be sent, thus doubling the risks. The slowness of transport was problematic, sometimes taking ships 2 to 3 months to reach their destination. Planes were used, but could not carry the same quantities of freight. To destabilize the Allies, the German Air Force bombed the Bradbury, Wilkinson and Company factory. Consequently, in December 1944, there were indeed delayed deliveries. A note dated December 8, 1944 states, "The production of banknotes executed by the Caisse Centrale in England has been considerably slowed down in recent months. The printing presses loaded with them having been damaged by bombardment. In fact, banknote deliveries should have been staggered from August to October, last started only at the end of November, and will likely not be completed until February. Because of these delays, the Equatorial French Africa and Cameroon are starting to run out of cash. The situation will become very serious there. Impossibility of paying the wages of the natives, interruption of the payment of public expenditure. If the banknotes whose production has just been completed in England are not transported there during the next 3 weeks. At the end of 1944, there was a serious monetary crisis in the empire." To conclude, we must try to provide an answer to the questions posed by this workshop, notably who paid for the Caisse Centrale de la France Libre. The funds advanced by the British government were placed in British Treasury bills and other British government funds. During the war, the Caisse Centrale reimbursed the British government. Ultimately, it was the French colonies that financed their own liberation and then contributed to the financing of the liberation of France, in accordance with General de Gaulle's wishes. De Gaulle, as we can see in his memoir, absolutely sought to make it clear that these British funds were merely advances. It's within this fact that the sovereignty of the Free French lay. He wrote, "I insisted that it was formulated in such a way that it was only a question of advances, the reimbursement of which would one day be assured, taking into account the supplies given by us in return. Full repayment took place effectively, and even during the conflict, so that in the end, our war effort was by no means the responsibility of England." So the goal was to retain French sovereignty over colonial territories and to acquire their unreserved support. Had the British taken direct control over the French colonial empire, the empire, along with its men and resources, would not have placed themselves in the hands of the Allies quite so easily. The battle between the British and the French in Madagascar from May to November 1942 would have been replicated elsewhere. Thus, the material aspect of the currency played a role in the confidence that the colonies of the French Empire placed in free France. The material aspect is also important for gaining sovereignty. Thank you, David.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for your talk, Mathieu. It was very, very enlightening. And so, for my question, were Vichy helped by the German occupiers to produce their currency?
In fact, the Bank of France called on for help for the French private sector to avoid any interference from Nazi Germany. The goal was to maintain sovereignty, and they only asked for help with the French private sector.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you very much for your intervention, Mathieu. And I'm sure it's been very interesting for all of those who are listening. Thank you very much.